Hey folks, hope you're all doing well. If you haven't noticed, there's been some buzz around the interwebs about a study that came out that suggests that a low carb diet will shorten your life. This has been picked up by every media outlet known to human and other kind. BBC News, Newsweek, CNN, Fast Company, low carb diets may cut years off your life, study suggests super scary stuff, right? So maybe you've been tinkering with paleo, low carb, keto. You're like, what the hell? Is this thing going to kill me? Clearly I have a bias in all this stuff. I'm peddling this ancestral health model, which tends to be a bit more conservative on the carbohydrate side. This is, as of July of this year, 20 years that I've been doing this. So I clearly have a bias in this. I would say that metabolically, this is where I function best. Maybe many of you find that you function best in this area too. But what I would encourage you to do is, uh, as I go through all this material, I'm going to mention a number of studies. I'm going to link to those studies in a blog post ultimately, but a lot of this material, they're review papers, and they tend to be very, very accessible, even if you don't have a huge medical or scientific background. So I would really encourage you to get in and read a bunch of this material. And there's some fascinating analyses and takeaways. And again, everybody's got a bias. I totally freely admit to that. I wish I was unbiased, but, from my perspective, for many people, they tend to benefit from some degree of carbohydrate restriction, and this being relative to just what's generally being eaten. And then beyond even just the carbohydrate restriction, as we get through this thing, we're going to find that the food quality story really matters. So anyway, let's kind of jump into this a little bit more. The original study was published in the Lancet, Dietary Carbohydrate Intake and Mortality, a prospective cohort study and meta-analysis. So, hey, I'm going to be reading a number of the kind of bylines that come out of this. About 80% of web traffic these days is consumed on a mobile device. Sometimes, even though, I'm doing a screen share and you can see this whole thing, sometimes folks can't see the whole thing. So maybe a little bit onerous if you're watching this on a larger screen, the fact that I'm going to read this stuff. But for some people, I think that'll be pretty helpful. But some of the details, the low carbohydrate diets, which restrict carbohydrate. Now, this is from that paper that restrict carbohydrate in favor of increased protein or fat intake, or both, are popular weight loss strategies. However, the long-term effect of carbohydrate restriction on mortality is controversial and could depend on whether dietary carbohydrate is replaced by plant-based or animal-based fat and protein. I emphasize that myself. We aim to investigate the association between carbohydrate intake and mortality. So the methods, these folks studied a little over 15,000 adults aged 45 to 64 in 4 U.S. communities who completed a dietary questionnaire at enrollment in the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities study. Primary outcome was all-cause mortality. So what they're looking at is they're trying to correlate what folks ate with how long they lived and looking at all-cause mortality. Finally, they assessed whether the substitution of animal or plant sources of fat and protein for carbohydrates affected mortality. So right from the get-go, and I don't want to go, I have a million different tangents I could take on this story, but there's a question here that's being asked, which is, are low-carb diets or carbohydrate-restricted diets problematic? And it's been mentioned many times, we're not able to do a legit randomized controlled trial where we start people at birth and feed them a particular diet and then clone the same population of people and feed them a different diet and then clone that same thing and feed them a diet, watch them all live out their whole life and then see what happens. We're never really going to be able to do that. What is pretty compelling are some randomized control trials that actually do interventions, and then we look for different benchmarks, total cholesterol, metabolic health, and what have you. And we've actually done those, and those are pretty interesting, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. But let's unpack a little bit of what's going on in this particular study. When the data was analyzed, the claim here is that we have this U-shaped curve, which U-curves in biology are just super sexy. If you think about vitamin D intake, for example, usually we have increased morbidity and mortality at very low intakes of vitamin D. And then we tend to get a low point of morbidity and mortality, sickness and death with kind of an optimized intake. And then we start getting an increase in morbidity and mortality when we have too much intake. So when you see a U curve in some sort of a biological system, it's kind of like, wow, okay, that's probably legit. And what this thing is suggesting is that it's somewhere around this like 50% of total calories consumed in the form of carbohydrate is in theory the claim of this paper, where the lowest morbidity or mortality specifically is occurring. And then if you're over here at 20% of carbohydrate intake, then your mortality is dramatically increased. In theory, it's a flatter. Sorry, my cursor's going all over the place. It's a flatter increase in mortality over on this side, which that's interesting also when we look at some stuff here in a little bit. But this is the claim. There's this U curve. There's this kind of optimized point of carbohydrate intake with regards to all-cause mortality. So Chris Kresser did an amazing takedown on this, and I'll share a link with that in a bit. He and I, whenever a paper like this comes out, then the folks in this kind of ancestral health community, we kind of ping each other and we're like, are you going to tackle this? Am I going to tackle it? Are we all going to tackle it? And so Chris really did a phenomenal job breaking down some of the, limitations of what the study is. And at the end of the day, this is another one of these nutritional epidemiology correlation studies. It does not show causation. And this is one of the problems, not to throw the vegan folks under the bus, but these correlation studies are presented as causation again and again and again. And that should raise some red flags right out of the gate. There is I thought about including it, but I didn't. There's this new Pure study, which just came out, which it suggests that you should eat fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, full-fat dairy, and unprocessed meat products. There's all kinds of controversy around this. And although I'm talking about it now, that's kind of funny. I had jettisoned including it because it's another one of these epidemiological correlation studies that is based around a food frequency questionnaire. And at this stage of the game, I just can't believe that these things are funded at all. And there have actually been a number of kind of review papers written suggesting that these things should not be funded because it's really not answering any type of questions. But we'll get into some of that here in a little bit. So this is from Chris Kresser. The subject diets were only assessed twice throughout a 25-year period, separated by an interval of 6 years. This means that people were asked to report on what they ate over the previous 6-year period. And even then, the food frequency questionnaires only covered 12 years of the 25-year period. So basically, this whole study was asking people, hey, what did you eat? Fill out this questionnaire, and it was done twice over this effectively 12-year period. But there was an enormous span of time in between these food frequency questionnaire interventions, and these things have just been shown to be incredibly fraught with error. People lie, they forget. There have been interesting studies where they will actually track what people really do eat, and then they will to actually look at what the folks are reporting. Hey, try to remember what you ate, and there's terrible overlap there. So these things were originally like a nice attempt at trying to get our hands around some of these bigger picture topics. But again, this is my bias. I'm hesitant to use too strong a language, I guess, in some ways, but some very smart scientists use some stronger language later. So I guess I'll default to that. But this is the piece by Chris Kresser, Will Low Carb Diet Shorten Your Life? That's at chriskresser.com/Will Low Carb Diet Shorten Your Life. If you just search Chris Kresser, Low Carb Shorten Life, you can probably track that down. But he does, again, a phenomenal job breaking this whole thing apart. Okay, so this is an interesting aside. This piece by Professor Salim Youssef appeared in the exact same issue of the Lancet as this original piece, and it's called Evolving Evidence About Diet and Health. Now, this is interesting because virtually no one mentioned that this other piece was in there, and this is basically kind of a cautionary tale that ended up in this same edition of the Lancet talking about these kind of food frequency questionnaire epidemiological correlation study researchers. So some of Dr. Yusuf's comments: nutrition research initially focused almost entirely on conditions of nutritional deficiencies. By the 1950s, with the increase in coronary heart disease in high-income countries, attention shifted to a range of so-called diet heart hypotheses, Ansel Keys, all that type of stuff. If you guys have followed this for a while, you'll be familiar with that. These included the putative, harmful effects of fats, especially saturated fats, and the protective effects of the so-called Mediterranean diet to explain why individuals in the US, Northern Europe, and UK were more prone to coronary heart disease. Some of the initial studies were enormously influential. That's a massive understatement, while undergoing limited scrutiny as to the rigor of their methods. The lack of replication of these early claims should have prompted caution and re-examination of whether fats, especially saturated fats, were indeed harmful. Based on first principles, this is Dr. Yusuf's comments, kind of getting back to that U-shaped curve. Based on first principles, a U-shaped association is logical between most essential nutrients versus health outcomes. And I apologize again. You can do some really selective editing by trimming commentary that folks have. So I have that ... because I cut stuff out. Part of this is brevity. I really tried to not selectively edit this so that I was really stilting this conversation in a direction that I wanted it to go. But again, this is an open access paper. I would really encourage you to read the whole thing and then judge me by the way that I've put this together. If I did some really selective editing of what Dr. Yusuf's full story was, then you should hold me accountable for that. But I tried to do the best job I could to keep the continuity without this thing being a giant book. So although carbohydrates are technically not essential nutrients, unlike protein and fats, a certain amount is probably required to meet short-term energy demands during physical activity and to maintain fat and protein intakes within their respective sweet spots. I'll sign off on that. I mean, we know from long-term interventions with ketogenic diets, this isn't necessarily the case, but if you're metabolically healthy, metabolically flexible, including whole unprocessed carbohydrates in your diet up to the point that you tolerate them is probably fine and maybe beneficial. So, really no big concerns around that. These findings of the meta-analysis, this is going back to the original paper, should be interpreted with caution given that so-called group thinking can lead to biases in what is published from observational studies and the use of analytical approaches to produce findings that fit with the current thinking. I mean, effectively what this is saying is that it's very easy to fudge the numbers. What was Mark Twain's term, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And again, yeah, I've got a bias on this, but this is my point here again is that this is a pretty interesting aside that was in the exact same edition of the Lancet that this original paper was published in, and virtually no one commented on it, particularly the mainstream media. This piece is not analyzed at all. There was no effort at providing any type of balance in this, which I guess is kind of what my job is, but just kind of an interesting aside. So going back to this U-shaped curve, the claim here is that, we've got this sweet spot right at about 50% of carbohydrate intake with regards to total calories is where things are great. If you're eating lower carb, you have a very steep dangerous, increased mortality rate. You have a flatter one if you're eating more carbs. So the theory goes. But check this out. I don't know if you guys remember this study. It was really a phenomenal piece of work. It's the A to Z study, A to Z weight loss study. It's a randomized controlled trial comparison of the Atkins Zone, Ornish, and Learn diets for change in weight and related risk factors among overweight premenopausal women. So just a little bit of background on the Learn. So we had a couple of different diets that were looked at here. Learn stands for Lifestyle, Exercise, Attitudes, and Relationships and Nutrition. The Learn program for weight management was written by Kelly Brownall to address the issue of low-carb diets that have been hitting the markets over the past few years. So this person put this program together because this individual thinks that low-carb diets are problematic and dangerous and a whole host of other issues. Instead of being a traditional book, Learn is a collection of worksheets, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's that interesting. What to eat. Lots of carbohydrates are allowed on this diet, about 60% of the total caloric intake, but fat is limited to less than 10%. There are no forbidden foods per se. Okay, I've got to say that one again. There are no forbidden foods per se. This is straight out of the standard dietetics playbook. They are absolutely up in arms that you would limit any type of dietary choices. The name of the game is portion control. And, for a tiny fraction of people, that works. For the vast majority of people, it doesn't. And I'm going to share, again, a biased perspective. But I think that this tendency to suggest that there are no foods that are problematic, that a Twinkie is easy to bypass as an apple, is ridiculous, and it's setting people up for failure. Instead, your top portion control, the importance of counting calories, and how to calculate your daily requirements based on your activity level. So that's what the Learn one is as part of this. Just wanted to point that out. So this is again from this A to Z paper. Context: popular diets, particularly those low in carbohydrates, have challenged current recommendations advising a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet for weight loss. Potential benefits and risks have not been tested adequately. The objective: to compare 4 weight loss diets representing a spectrum of low to high carbohydrate intake for effects on weight loss and related metabolic variables. So we have the Atkins at the, extreme low carb intervention side. You had Zone, you had Learn, and then Ornish as the setup. Design and setting: a 12-month randomized trial conducted in the United States. There were 311 free living, overweight, obese, non-diabetic, premenopausal women. Participants were randomly assigned to follow Atkins, Zone, Learn, or Ornish. With these diets, they received weekly instruction for 2 months and then add an additional 10-month follow-up. So these folks were taught, in theory, how to eat these foods and then given support materials. There was a period of time where they would check back in, and then they were kind of off on their own. And so this is one of the limitations of a study like this. You don't really know for sure what these folks ate, but it would be enormously demanding and expensive to lock these people in a metabolic ward for a year and see what the outcome is. So this is trying to do the best work that they can within these parameters. But let's look at the outcome. Weight loss at 12 months was a primary outcome. Secondary outcomes included lipid profiles, LDL, HDL, non-HDL lipoprotein cholesterol, and also triglyceride levels, percentage of body fat, waist to hip ratio, fasting insulin, glucose levels, and blood pressure. Outcomes were assessed at month 0, 2, 6, and 12. And the results: weight loss was greatest for women in the Atkins group compared to the other diet groups at 12 months. So I'll go ahead and mention what the others were. Weight loss was significantly different between Atkins and Zone diets. So Atkins had much greater weight loss. The overall Atkins was on average 4.7 kilograms loss. Zone was about 1.6 kilograms loss. Learn 2.6 and Ornish 2.2. Weight loss was not statistically significant between Zone, Learn, and Ornish groups at 12 months. Here's an important point. At 12 months, secondary outcomes for Atkins group, these were all the blood lipids, waist to hip ratio, all these kind of metabolic markers of health were comparable, were more favorable than the other groups. So the group that lost the most weight and had the greatest improvements in metabolic profiles, this was the Atkins group. So the conclusions in this study: premenopausal, overweight, and obese women assigned to follow the Atkins diet, which had the lowest carbohydrate intake, lost more weight and experienced more favorable overall metabolic effects at 12 months than women assigned to follow the Zone, Ornish, Learn, etc. So the reason in part why I brought this paper up is there's a claim within the original paper. Let's back up here real quick. This claim that there's some people in this study that are eating low carb, okay, and that this low carb intake was actually associated with increased mortality. What's interesting is all the parameters that we would associate with probably improving all-cause mortality, improved metabolic functions, and overall maximized weight loss compared to these other interventions was best on Atkins. But here's a piece to this that's not well appreciated. When you really looked at what people were reporting eating, they were taught to eat Atkins, which is quite low in carbohydrate, 20 to 30 grams a day, maybe as high as 50 as the intervention. But when you looked at where people actually settled out, they actually were at about zone ratios. The way that people just have a natural tendency to slide to the middle, they started kind of zone, or excuse me, they started more or less Atkins, and then they kind of slid to zone ratios. So my question here is, and it's hard to get people to eat low carb. Lots of people have success, lots of people do it, but this is, the recidivism around dietary change is just enormous. So one of the questions that I have, just kind of a nebulous big picture question, is who are the people in theory that are eating the super low carb side of things? Even when people are put in a dietary intervention and are told and taught and counseled how to eat low carb, they don't eat low carb. They end up sliding to basically like a modest carb zone ratio. So, that's just this kind of weird thing. Like, who are the people that are actually eating this way? Or was this completely an artifact of like terrible food frequency reporting, which is more the way that I would lean towards this? So that's a thought. This was definitely a super well-designed study. They taught folks how to eat in a given way. There was, with it, short of doing a metabolic ward intervention, this was a pretty damn good study. It's had a lot of respect. The metabolic changes kind of speak for themselves. So, but like I said, despite the best efforts to keep people in that more Atkins area, they tended to slide to the middle. That's one thing. So another part. Shifting gears, sorry. Again, thinking like a million things on this, but according to the current study, the middle is where we should belong. But the middle is going to be kind of problematic. And by the middle, this is like that protein, carb, fat mix, which is what the standard dietetics model is recommending, and we shouldn't limit anything. I'll get to some of the limitations with that. And I think that I mentioned this, if these folks could not eat low carb, who were the low carb folks in the current paper? And again, that, 2 food frequency reports over a 25-year period. So just all kinds of dubious stuff with that when you consider how much media attention this thing had. So this is a study that came out pretty recently, effective a low-fat versus low-carbohydrate diet, 12-month weight loss in overweight adults. And they looked at genotype pattern with regards to insulin secretion. It's called the Diet Fits randomized clinical trial. So we had another randomized study, not a food frequency questionnaire. Yes, it has tons of problems and limitations with it, but here's some of the stuff, and then we'll try to unpack this thing. So what is the effect of a healthy low-fat diet versus a healthy low-carbohydrate diet with regards to weight change at 12 months? And are these effects related to genotype, pattern, insulin secretion, what have you? So this was a cool study where they actually got in, and whether they were recommending a low-fat diet or a high-fat diet, they focused on whole unprocessed foods and really tried to teach people what good eating was. Like, just make it, focusing on these whole food groups. And sorry, I'm dying here. So the findings in this randomized clinical trial among 609 overweight adults, weight change over 12 months was not significantly different for participants in the healthy low-fat group or the healthy low-carb group. The healthy low-carb group did lose a little bit more weight, but not statistically significant. There appeared to be no significant diet genotype interaction with this thing. There was no significant difference in the weight loss between both groups. The interesting thing about this, couple of things. One is that if you really focus on food quality and you get people out of the middle, if you get them either higher carb, lower fat, whole unprocessed foods, high fat, low carb, and I would say really high protein, low carb, and whole unprocessed foods, they make some pretty significant improvements. I don't think that the high carb intervention would work for me personally, because I just feel terrible on these higher carbohydrate intakes. And it's interesting that we didn't see more issues with that, like the Weizmann Institute intervention where we saw different blood glucose responses to folks. But an interesting takeaway, so both approaches focused on whole foods. Both interventions were reasonably successful. The extremes tended to slide to the middle. This is similar to the Atkins study, where even though they counseled people to start at these extremes of either low fat or high fat, people tended to drift towards the middle again. Now, despite that, people made significant health and weight improvements on this approach. And many of the participants reported that they would continue eating this way indefinitely. So the real benefit here was teaching people to eat whole, unprocessed foods. I would argue that if they did a little bit of, poking around, asking folks, how do you feel between meals and whatnot, we could get even more customization. But again, at the end of the day, with this Diet Fit study, people tended to slide to the middle. But the fact that they started with whole unprocessed foods was really a win when we get right down to it. So when we look at daily calories consumed by the average American, things haven't changed over time a ton. And so I've got a graph here. I know some people won't be able to see this great. I'm also sending this audio piece out as a podcast bonus. But we have some charts that compare before the obesity crisis of 1970 and then at the peak of the obesity crisis around 2010. Overall, everybody's eating more of everything, whether it's fruit, dairy, vegetables, I guess a little bit more, but they're eating more grains, more added fat, more added sugar. So we're eating more overall, without a doubt. But what's interesting is we're eating significantly more added fat, oils and dairy fats, and then also grain products and added sugar. People aren't going out and just eating white flour by itself. People aren't going out and just eating sugar by itself. What people are doing is going out and eating processed, hyperpalatable foods. So people are eating more of everything, and that's a problem. And then I would argue that what is consistently missed, and this is tinfoil hat, conspiracy theory type stuff, but there is just really remarkable collusion between the food industries, government, and these governing bodies that are supposed to be protecting us and our health. The American Dietetics Association, or I forget what they've changed their name to now, but American Medical Association, they're fully on board with this. No food is off limits. You just need to limit portions. And what I think if we've learned anything from some of these well-performed dietary interventions, like the Diet Fit study, like the Atkins intervention, people have a tendency, despite their best efforts, to slide into this middle ground. The middle ground is where we end up with these highly complex, hyperpalatable food combinations. And at the end of the day, again, people are mainly, I think the areas that they're over-consuming food is in the processed food arena. And so the focus really needs to be on whole unprocessed foods, which to a degree that's the case. But when you look at some of the endorsements that come out of the mainstream and the reticence to really just call junk food, that's a problem, and it's not really serving folks well. I don't know if you guys have seen this, the Doritos roulette. Actually, I didn't grab the one that has the different logo on it, but it has different bags have a logo that says caution, some chips are extremely hot. So within a single bag, what these folks have done is figured out a way of getting a mixed palate experience. Some of the chips are apparently melt your face off hot. Some of them are medium. Some of them are mild. And when I pinged the folks that make this, I didn't expect to get an email back, but I shot them an email and I said, hey, I'm kind of a food researcher. By chance, does the distribution of these chips follow kind of a power law with regards to randomization? And there's all kinds of interesting stuff in biology that follows power laws. And if you want to make something really addictive, you don't give it to people in a consistent fashion. You actually randomize the exposure. So this food randomizes the exposure of the heat. There's an anticipatory element that is baked in the cake with it. And it really maximizes the tendency to eat the whole bag because of that food reward, because of the mixed palate experience, the unknown, which increases that dopamine response. So this is where that increased fat, grains in the form of flour and sugars is basically being consumed. Foods like this. And the food scientists are really savvy to evolutionary biology, neuroregulation of appetite, and trying to have a conversation around this topic or these related topics with most of the dietetics world. They look at you like you have three heads because it's just portion control, eat less, move more, everything in moderation. And that, it just doesn't work. I think you guys are kind of on board with that. But Marty Kendall over at Optimizing Nutrition, optimizingnutrition.com, he's just done some amazing work. And he analyzed, I think it was 500,000 inputs in MyFitnessPal, looking at the amount of protein, carbs, and fat and fiber that folks are consuming. And he did kind of a correlation with that, the amount of these different macronutrients and their relative satiety, like how much you could eat versus the level of satiety. And I apologize, this is cutting that thing off the bottom, so you can't see the bottom of the chart here. But effectively, where people are consuming their nutrients, the amounts or the ratios are at an optimization for maximum caloric intake. If they ate more fiber, they would eat less food overall. If they ate more protein, they would eat less food overall. If they ate less fat, they would probably do better in general because of this mixed diet. But instinctively, people are following this kind of optimum foraging strategy. They're just going out, and in this free living environment, they are instinctively finding the optimum amount of calories to eat. So I would really recommend checking out Marty Kendall's work, optimizingnutrition.com. It's really phenomenal. I'm sorry again that the bottom of this chart got cut off, but this plays into a brand new paper that came out recently, just in July. It's called the Supra Additive Effects of Combining Fat and Carbohydrate on Food Reward. This thing's really interesting. They did brain imaging on folks and then had them look at different foods, either carbohydrate food exclusively, fat exclusively, or fat carbohydrate combos. And then they looked at what part of the brain was involved in kind of processing the information about the food and how much was there, what the potential caloric value was and whatnot. And what's really interesting is that the fat carb combo was incredibly difficult. Basically, people could not make good sense of how much caloric density was there. And their willingness to kind of go out of their way to acquire that fat carb combo was really, really powerful. So this work shows that foods containing fat and carbohydrate are more reinforcing than the equal caloric foods containing only fat or carbohydrate. This effect is independent of liking and is reflected by supra-additive responses in the striatum during food valuation. This may be one mechanism driving overconsumption of high-fat/carbohydrate processed foods. So we're even getting some brain imaging that's suggesting that sliding to the middle, being in that place of moderation, may be incredibly problematic. Now, if we're talking about like a, quote, Mediterranean diet that is largely whole unprocessed foods, if you've got a plate of whitefish or sardines with some slow-cooked lentils and a bunch of veggies and some olive oil on top, that is a fat carb combo, but that is not a bag of Doritos. These are entirely different, stories there. And I would even argue that if we were to get in and get really granular, that folks would probably have even better appetite control separating those foods out, like making it mainly a protein carbohydrate meal or a protein fat meal. And this kind of goes back to some of the old food combining stuff that I think that probably everybody is at least somewhat familiar with. So this is an interesting brain imaging study that looks at this food reward kind of story and how difficult it is for people to moderate their food intake when they are faced with a fat carb combo, these hyperpalatable foods. So this is an amazing paper, and if you guys read anything, if you check out any of the associated material, I really recommend that you read this. It's called The Challenge of Reforming Nutritional Epidemiological Research. This is by Dr. John Ioannidis. This guy is just an icon in medicine, and he's been really critical over the years of these food frequency questionnaires, the nutritional epidemiology, and this paper is just a neutron bomb dropped on the nutritional epidemiology world. At least it starts that way. The paper finishes a little bit fluffy. I think that the guy should have maintained a harder line with it, but we'll look at some of the stuff in here, some of Dr. Ioannidis' comments. Some nutrition scientists and much of the public often consider epidemiological associations of nutritional factors to represent causal effects that can inform public health policy and guidelines. correlation doesn't equal causation, but it is presented that way time and again. However, the emerging picture of nutritional epidemiology is difficult to reconcile with good scientific principles. Field needs radical reform. Authors often use causal language when reporting the findings from these studies. Example, optimal consumption of risk-decreasing foods results in a 56% reduction of all-cause mortality. This is some of the stuff, just as an aside, like when typically vegans, but it can be a variety of people, will pull up the consuming red meat or consuming processed meat increases your risk of, say, like colon cancer by 26%. It's coming off food frequency questionnaires and all this other stuff. It's correlation, it's not causation. And also what they're doing is they're looking at a difference in absolute versus relative risk. The absolute risk typically in these stories goes from 6% or 5% for the whole population. Just as a background, there's about a 5% risk of developing colon cancer for the general population. In theory, if you're eating like processed meat, bacon every single day your whole life, it increases that total risk to 6%. So the way it's reported, though, is the difference between those, which is about 20%. So there's all kinds of ways that these numbers get fiddled. Going back to the paper, even when authors add caveats, results are still often presented by the media as causal. So this is that thing again where the lack of diligence and the tendency to have a narrative that folks are trying to put across. And again, I've got my own narrative. I'm in this ancestral health scene. I'm kind of pro moderate to low carb diets. At a minimum, I would suggest that you should check your blood glucose response to a variety of carbohydrate foods and find what works for you. So I've got my own narrative, but there's clearly a bias towards this suggestion that no foods should be off limits and that this middle ground is where things are optimized. And I just don't know that we can really sell that all the way across the board. These implausible estimates of benefits or risks associated with diet probably reflect almost exclusively the magnitude of the cumulative biases in this type of research, with extensive residual confounding and selective reporting. Disentangling the potential influence on health outcomes of a single dietary component from these other variables is challenging, if not impossible. So when you're trying to look at bacon or milk or what have you as a single component and lay blame to it, it's just not working the same way that this whole process did for, say, like cigarettes or tobacco. Similarly limited self-reported nutrition data ascertained with a handful of questions, and self-reported items fail to acknowledge or accurately measure a system that matches or exceeds the genome in complexity. So what he's saying here, and this is where, like, if you've got a little bit of a scientific background, this is just like it's velvety smooth and magic. It's pretty powerful, but people are taking, again, like this study that caused all this furor, a self-reported food frequency questionnaire checked twice over a 25-year period with huge gaps in between the spans that people are supposed to self-report. We are assigning a risk around that, claiming that it has effects on all-cause mortality, when the interaction of our nutrients with our gut microbiome is greater than the total complexity of our genome. And so it's pretty powerful stuff. I'm not doing an exceptional job of explaining that. And this is, again, where, like, if you get a chance or you have the inclination, read this whole paper on your own. Trying to pull this stuff all together, so again, I'm biased. I've got a bias, but what do you do with all this stuff? There's a lot, and I'm working on some material that will look at fasting and mTOR and overall health and longevity. Literally, this stuff is turning into a book, because if you don't do an incredibly thorough job of tackling all these topics, if you leave one little crack unaddressed or multiple little cracks unaddressed, then people will pop up on the interwebs and they're like, well, you didn't address this, you didn't address that, so your whole point is moot. So it ends up being effectively like a book trying to address this stuff. So I'm going to do a super kind of big picture overview on this whole thing. So what should you do with regards to health and longevity, like what's kind of the optimum on that stuff. And again, this is my bias, but this is an interesting paper, which I'm going to get the author on the podcast to talk about this. But this is, so the name of the paper is from Biogerontology. Caloric restriction does not enhance longevity in all species and is unlikely to do so in humans. This paper kind of is it's interesting because everybody is so excited about caloric restriction and fasting, and there's cool stuff to it without a doubt, but not everybody realizes that caloric restriction doesn't improve health and longevity in all species. In the species that it does improve health and longevity, in the limited examples where an ancestral diet, a species-specific diet, has been compared with the caloric restriction, it doesn't improve health and longevity. In many cases, it shortens that or decreases it. And so there's really a strong case to be made that possibly all of this calorie restriction research, or a significant amount of it, the benefit that we see is simply that these animals are being protected from eating a highly processed lab chow diet. This is not dissimilar from, the potential, could caloric restriction improve health in living humans? Yeah. If they're eating a really poor processed diet, then yeah, without a doubt, eating less of it is probably going to be good. The problem is getting people to do that. They don't do it. What they do need to do is figure out a way of spontaneously reducing caloric intake to a maintenance level. And from what we've seen with, say, like the Diet Fit study, there's a couple of different routes to that, but it mainly focuses on whole unprocessed foods. And you kind of need to goose people initially. You need to pre-select them initially towards either kind of a high carb, low fat whole foods, or a high fat, low carb, and again, I would say kind of high protein whole foods approach. And then they will probably drift towards the center over time, because that's just the tendency that people have. But those are the ways that you're going to get people to eat, the dietary intervention that's really going to affect health and longevity the most. So a couple of takeaways here as we get close to wrapping up to try to put some context in this whole story. At the end of the day, the biggest factor with your all-cause mortality is don't overeat. I mean, don't smoke too, and probably don't go bungee jumping without a bungee. But, if you just don't overeat, you're really ahead of the curve. Now, I have an asterisk on that. Just not overeating is trite to say. It's damn hard to do, particularly in the modern hyperpalatable food environment, which is why I mentioned, what we could potentially learn from that Diet Fit study. Whole unprocessed food, either kind of higher carb, kind of lower carb, and run with that. Like if you are following like that learn recommendation, where no food is off limits and you're just going to portion control. Some people can do that. I think that all those people probably wear dresses made out of human skins at various points, because they're like a serial killer. Like I very few people can follow through on that approach. So if you do, great, but the vast majority of people don't. And we do have, from randomized control trials, some guidelines that suggest, one, that if you're metabolically broken, like in that A to Z study, if you have some metabolic issues, a low-carb diet is probably the way that you want to go. If you're not metabolically broken, then you probably have more latitude. But again, you're going to want to stay out of that middle zone. The middle zone of the Doritos and the Twinkies and everything in moderation just really doesn't work that well. You got to mind your circadian biology. You need to sleep appropriately, particularly within seasonal changes. Maybe eating more of your calories earlier in the day may have some really potent benefits. A little bit of time-restricted eating, but I don't know that you're going to get a massive benefit relative to something that's fairly reasonable, like breakfast at 8 or 9 a.m. and then dinner at maybe 4 or 5 p.m. If you can pull that off most days, would probably be really powerful. Find an appropriate glycemic load. This is the stuff that I covered in Wired to Eat, doing the 7-day carb test. Different people respond to different foods, differently, and that was a lot of difference. But I think there's a great case to be made for just doing a little bit of blood sugar testing to see how you do with white rice versus white potatoes, and if you really like those foods, but you get a kind of massive blood sugar response and you get some symptoms around it, like you don't feel good, you get on a blood sugar roller coaster, maybe you just need to reduce the total amount of those that you consume. So, but I think it's worth looking into. Number 4, be mindful of immunogenic foods. This is kind of where the paleo concept comes in. If paleo really shines, it's shining a light on potentially immunogenic or problematic foods, grains, legumes, dairy, maybe nightshades for some people. But when I put tomatoes in my Instagram posts, people lose their minds. Like, I just don't seem to negatively react to tomatoes, and other nightshades. If you do, then that's fine, but not everybody does. So it's not a verboten food straight out of the gate. But this is where like a 7-day or a 30-day elimination diet, kind of paleo type approach, remove grains, legumes, and dairy, reintroduce them. Like, we've seen so many people benefit from that. It's not a crazy recommendation. So again, be mindful of immunogenic foods, lift weights, 2, maybe 3 days a week, 30 minutes a session, full body. You don't need to be a bodybuilder, but virtually everybody would benefit from holding 5 to 10 more pounds of muscle mass. It just improves your ability to dispose of glucose. It reduces, when you talk about all-cause mortality, like your ability to go from seated to on the floor to standing without assisting yourself is one of the greatest indicators of how soon you're going to die. And one of the main factors there is how much muscle mass you carry. So lift some weights, even if you don't like lifting weights. Just get in and bang it out, do some circuit training 2 days a week. It just has remarkable benefits. Sauna. I don't know, dry sauna, wet sauna, infrared sauna. I'm not really sure. I think, the jury is still out on that. I think the bulk of the research has been on the dry, hot saunas. But when you look at the kind of return on investment, a couple of days a week, 20 to 30 minutes a pop, it's pretty enjoyable to do. That seems to be huge. Try to find some meaning in your life. I'm not here to proselytize or tell you what that meaning is, but people that have meaning in their life, they live longer. And that ties into the social connections, which is my last point. Like, if you're really looking for overall health and longevity, these are the factors, which in my second book, I had the 4 pillars of sleep, food, movement, and community. They all kind of nest under this stuff, but the sauna is super sexy and seems to produce a lot of good benefits. So wrapping this thing up, there will always be back and forth on the story. There probably will always be back and forth on the story of, what's the optimal way to eat. And I don't know that there is an optimal way for any. You can't take a macro dietary recommendation and throw it out to the masses and have anything but problems. Other than if you start getting a little bit granular, focus on whole unprocessed foods, minimize processed foods, be aware of immunogenic foods, be aware of your kind of glycemic load and what have you. But there's going to be battles over that all the time. Like, this is just religious level conviction that people have. The paleo, carnivore, low carb scene is as crazy as the vegan scene, even the raw vegans. I've seen stuff come out of the carnivore scene that would make promulgators of 30 bananas a day absolutely blush with how over the top and ridiculous it is. It's a tool. It's nothing more than a tool. It's a great tool. All these things can be great tools. But when you come across like an idiot like that, then you're ultimately the biggest tool, but whatever. But here's something. I'm always kind of a student of how the economics of a story are playing into a particular topic. And there's huge financial interests in keeping people in the middle ground of this dietary story, which seems to be the most problematic place to be. Okay? If you just buy into that for a little bit, let's assume that we're right about that. If people are sick, and I'm not saying that there's like this concerted effort to make people sick, although when you consider that drug companies also own food companies, also own like pesticide companies, and maybe a little bit of collusion there. But anyway, if everybody got off diabetes meds, if everybody went off insulin, the way that we would eat to affect that change, like the biggest payday food industry features, which are these highly processed, long shelf life foods, they're gone. People wouldn't be eating that, or they wouldn't be eating it remotely in the amounts that they are right now. So there's huge financial incentives to keep people sick. I don't think that's too crazy of a suggestion. It's not super tinfoil hat when you really think about all the implications there. But when we get in and start talking about different types of insurance, there's really powerful selection motivations, selection criteria that are motivating insurers to figure out what the real story is in this whole thing. So I have a website here from this institution or outfit called Swiss Re, which you maybe have never heard of these folks, but they've probably heard of you. There's a pretty good chance that if you have some type of insurance, particularly life insurance, somewhere in the underwriting chain of custody, Swiss Re probably underwrites your insurance some way, somehow, somewhere. I think they're the second largest underwriter in the world, or possibly the largest underwriter, the largest underwriter of life insurance. But the life insurance piece is where these folks are really looking hard at where they're saving money or losing money. And if you're underwriting life insurance claims, the way that you win that game is people live longer, period. If people aren't living a long time and then these underwriters are paying out at too high of a clip, it's a problem for them. Their profitability goes down. Who knows? They might even go bankrupt. So Swiss Re is one of the largest underwriters in the world. They're very interested in how long folks are living. So we poke around on the Swiss Re website. You go to their research library, and one of the first things that you find is this piece by Martin White, The Role of Commercial Food Systems in Promoting Health Through Better Diet. This is an interesting talk in and of itself, but there's lots of interesting stuff on here. Swiss Re also has a piece from John Ioannidis talking about the role of bias in nutritional research. So this is pretty interesting. Like, these people who their financial existence and profitability is tied towards maybe finding a way of eating that would most benefit health and longevity, they're bringing in some pretty interesting people, and they're actually bringing in folks that are incredibly critical of the exact type of research that spawned all of this kind of media fervor over this notion that low-carb diets shorten lifespan. Well, if we poke around a little bit more, these folks also recently hosted a pretty interesting forum, and they had multiple panels looking at low-carb, high-fat diets, public controversies, and opportunities. Basic backstory here is that these folks are very interested in low carbohydrate diets, and I will go out there and say that they're looking hard at the notion that a whole foods, low glycemic load diet, shall we say, good fats, is probably the way that people are going to live longest. I'm not saying that there aren't ways to eat differently and still have health and longevity, but it's just really interesting when you look at what the kind of underlying motivations are, the aligning incentives. These folks are going to make more money if they help people to live longer. The notion of vegan diets and plant-based diets, man, you have to try not to look into that stuff. And that is not where these folks are looking. So you can kind of draw from that as you will. And again, I'm biased, so I've just presented my bias. I presented this story in my biased way. We are slowly seeing some insurance companies pop up that are offering incentives for, say, like vegetarians and vegans to join their ranks. It'll be interesting over time. Like, will we end up with an insurance product, both health and life related, that brings ancestral health low carbers into the mix? But interestingly, this is where that story is going to get ultimately addressed. These food frequency questionnaire studies, these correlation studies, are not going to bear this out. Funny enough, it's going to be kind of market driven and insurance that will finally put kind of a period on this story. So anyway, this is my long rambling, highly biased look at this study suggesting that low carb diets will shorten your life. Fire off some questions. I'm always here to help you guys, and thanks for your time.